Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Each week, we address issues of timely and timeless concern with newsmakers and the journalists who report on them, with artists, writers, scientists, educators, social scientists, government and nonprofit leaders. We speak with each one to one. I'm delighted to welcome the Reverend Rosemary Bray McNatt to the program today. She's Senior Minister of the Fourth Universalist Society in the city of New York on Manhattan's Upper West Side. If her name sounds familiar, it may be because in a previous incarnation, she was Rosemary Bray, an editor at the New York Times Book Review, the author of thoughtful and elegantly written pieces for the New York Times Magazine, and author of the moving memoir, Unafraid of the Dark. We'll explore how and why a person whose prior occupation was focused largely on developing her own individual voice turned to an occupation that's focused on serving the needs of others. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much.
So you were a journalist for 20 years before you decided to enter the seminary and become a Unitarian minister. It's kind of a dramatic
A little
change.
bit dramatic,
What
yeah.
prompted it?
Well, you know, part of the time, all the time, in fact, that I was writing, I was an active Unitarian Universalist. I was active in church. And I kind of married into the faith because...
Were you raised a Unitarian?
No, I was raised Roman Catholic in Chicago.
Oh, okay.
So, but I was raised in that kind of social justice Roman Catholic communities of the 60s and 70s.
Right.
I always say I was a kumbaya Catholic.
Okay.
And so I was very used to a religious community that did a lot of social justice work. But the church and I, in the Catholic tradition, had irreconcilable differences because of their role, their stance about women. And when I was 10, I couldn't serve Mass because I was a girl. And that was kind of it for me. So even though I felt close to God, the God of my understanding at that time, I just kind of walked away from it all by the time I was 14, because that was when I could convince my parents I didn't have to go to church anymore.
Okay.
So, but I married into the Unitarian Universalist community because my husband was raised Unitarian Universalist, and when we started dating in college, there was this moment when we were kind of getting to know each other, and he asked me if I was religious, and I said, well, you know, I believe in God, but I don't practice anything right now. And I said, well, what about you? And he said, I'm Unitarian. I said, what's that? Because I had no idea what it was.
Right.
And so you sort of fast forward until we get married, and I got married in a Unitarian church, First Unitarian in Chicago, because Chicago's where I'm from. We came back from our honeymoon, and I started going to church with his parents at Community Church of New York, which is the kind of home church of my husband's family. And I started actually listening to the sermons. And it was the sense of liberality, of freedom, the idea that it was right for us to question things, the idea that our spiritual journeys were individual and very much our own, and that there were lots of wise people along the way, and that there was more than one way to look at the sacred, really appealed to me. So I got involved as a lay leader.
Okay.
So this is going on all the time that I'm writing and editing.
Were you called? Some people talk about being called to the ministry. Were you called to the ministry?
I actually was. And it wasn't the traditional, okay, you go be a minister. But I was actually by then an active lay leader, and I was at a women's retreat where I was one of the keynote speakers, and the other was a Wiccan leader named Starhawk, and also a very active social justice person. And we were doing what's called a spiral dance, and I didn't want to do it because it was out in the woods at night and it was cold, and I'm an urban person, so that was so not me. But I thought it was rude not to go. So we're dancing in this circle, and we're being asked to speak to the holy, and I'm just kind of grumbling under my breath about, you know, oh, I don't want to be out here. And suddenly there was this presence. And I could feel it from the bottom of my feet just sort of enter into my body. And I got scared because I'd never had an experience like that. And then I heard a voice, but it's even wrong to say that I heard the voice. I felt the voice. The voice was me. It was, and it had no gender, which was what was persuasive for me. I didn't hear a man's voice. I didn't hear a woman's voice. And the voice said, "Don't worry, my child." And I was like, okay. So then I started talking really fast. And I was like, well, you know, I have a husband. I don't have kids. I'm writing. I don't know what I'm doing. Da 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 da. And I'm just kind of babbling to this presence. And the presence says, all these things and more. And then it kind of,
Wow.
yeah, that's what I said. I was like, okay.
I guess I've been called.
Really, it scared me so bad, I didn't even know what to say. I didn't even tell anybody about it for a couple of days. I didn't even tell Bob about it for a couple of days. Because I was like, what does this mean? And then I just started thinking about it more and thinking about how might I serve? And, you know, people at church had always been saying, when are you going to seminary? And I'd say, I'm not going to seminary, because all I could think of was, I don't want to be a minister. I don't want to listen to people tell me their problems all day. I don't want to do that. I want to think. I want to write. I want to do all these other things. But it got more and more appealing. But it took a long time for me to make the decision. It really did.
Yeah. I know of a number of people, several journalists, at least one lawyer, and somebody who I think I did, she was office furniture design, who after long careers in those areas went into the ministry. I would think that would be something very satisfying after spending so many years being ambitious and pursuing career goals and promoting yourself, to go to something that is more helping of other people.
Well, it has its own set of dangers, because if you're a person who likes to help people anyway, you can easily get sucked into a place where you're helping past an appropriate boundary.
Okay.
There is a lot of satisfaction in it, more than I imagined. Because not only do you have these relationships with people in your immediate community, in your immediate congregation, you get to hear all the things about their lives that other people don't necessarily know about. One of our Unitarian Universalist ministers is a man named Josiah Bartlett, who has, I think, retired. But he said that ministry was the best seat in the theater of life. And it really is. Part of our training includes working in hospitals as a chaplain over the summer, and there was a time when I thought I wanted to do that. But I realized, at least for me, that the intensity of it day to day would be too much, that I needed the circle of life. I needed not just to be talking to people when people were approaching the end of life, or helping people make difficult decisions about whether to place an elderly parent in a home or something like that. I needed also to be able to do the weddings and the child dedications, and you know, the celebrations about all the other things that go on in life. And when you're in a religious community, that's what you get to do all of that.
I think a lot of people have only, like you earlier, have only a vague notion of what Unitarianism is. So, I mean, is it a religion? Is it a kind of Protestant church? Is it a church at all? Some people say it's not really a church because it's not necessarily Christian. Are Unitarians Christians? What is it?
Some of us are and some of us aren't.
Right.
Unitarian Universalism, and that's our full name, we came from two separate religions. There were Unitarians, and the classic Unitarian definition is the unity of God. And Universalism has its roots in like the 17th century, and it's a universal salvation. Those are the classical definitions. But as you say, we are not Christians in the traditional sense. Some of us are people who consider themselves followers of Jesus. But the notions of the divinity of God, notions about the Trinity, these are all things that we don't necessarily agree with. We don't believe that a loving God would condemn people to hell. So hell's not real for us. We also believe that there is beauty and wisdom and truth to be found in other religious traditions. And one of the reasons I was drawn to Unitarian Universalism was because it answered questions for me that I'd had when I was a kid going to Catholic school. Because I couldn't figure out why, if Jesus loved us, Jesus would be mad at us if we didn't know who Jesus was. That didn't make sense to me. You know, and you can't ask the nuns those questions, they get very upset with you.
Right.
But I thought it made more sense to have a God who loved you and wanted the best for you no matter what, because they were always saying that God was like this loving father and God was like a loving parent. And I just thought about, well, if I'd done something and I didn't know it was wrong, my mother wouldn't punish me anyway.
Right.
You know, so why would God do that? So the answer to your question is that we have a wide variety of religious beliefs, and what we share are common values, a common set of values. Some of us believe that there is no God at all. Some of us believe that we are God's hands and feet. Some of us are much more interested in practices related to Buddhism and the sense of self-awareness and self-understanding. But we all believe that all human beings have a right to be free. And freedom is a very important concept for us. It's very important that people be free to think, to believe, to refuse to believe, and to find their own way.
Some people would argue that many Unitarians are really atheists or agnostics who can't bring themselves to fix their mouths around the word.
Well, that's because they've never been to my church. I've got atheists and agnostics in my congregation.
Okay.
And they're happy to tell me that they're atheists and agnostics.
Okay.
And I actually find it profoundly refreshing to have spiritual community with people who have a wide variety of belief. If I had to say who most of my folks were, I'd say that they were seekers, that they were eager to find where the wisdom was in any religious tradition. But I also have atheists in my congregation who believe that this is it. All we have is ourselves, and human agency is primary. And so we wrestle with those questions all the time, and I try to preach through those questions all the time.
Right. So tell me about the Fourth Universalist Society. How big your congregation is, who's in it?
We have a big building with a small congregation. We have about 120 members and some related friends, people who come but don't necessarily join. The building itself was built in like 1898, and in fact, we're coming up on our 175th anniversary this fall.
Was it built as a Unitarian?
It was built as a Universalist church.
Okay.
And that's important to know because when you go to most Unitarian churches that are historically Unitarian, they're very stark. They're very simple. There's stained glass, but there's no iconography. Universalist churches in their early incarnation were very much Trinitarian. So there's lots of Jesus in my church everywhere. There's crosses everywhere. There's all these picture windows. We have this huge, beautiful altar by Tiffany that has the 12 apostles symbols in it. So there's a lot of Christian iconography in my church.
Right.
So. But it's a beautiful old building. Like I said, we're celebrating our 175th anniversary, so we've always been part of New York life, and we've been in different locations in the city.
Okay.
So we're still very much a social justice church.
How about racial? What's the racial and ethnic breakdown of your church?
Well, it is about, I'd say about 15 to 20% of our people are people of color. We have several interracial families. We have lots of interreligious families. We have some kids
that you find a lot of in Unitarian.
Yes, you find that it's a very common thing in Unitarian Universalism. So we have Asian folks, Hispanic folks, multiracial folks. We have a lot of different kinds of people. And a lot of us are typical Upper West Siders. You know, we're teachers, we're psychologists, we're actors. I have a lot of actors, a lot of singers, a lot of dancers.
Okay, you almost get down.
We have a lot of fun. We have a lot of fun.
We're going to take a short break, then we'll be back with more with the Reverend Rosemary Bray McNatt after this. Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with the Reverend Rosemary Bray McNatt of the Fourth Universalist Society. Compared to some other religious groups, Catholics or Protestants, probably even Muslims, Unitarians are a very small group in this country. I mean, the last number I heard was 165,000.
I think there's about 165,000 who are registered.
Okay.
And then we do surveys and we find out that there are people who, when they are asked what they are, say that they're Unitarian Universalists, and those numbers are about 650,000.
Oh, really?
But they're not in our churches. And so one of the most interesting things for us is, what is it about us that has made it possible for people to claim us, but not necessarily show up at where we are.
Okay.
And that's a big conversation among Unitarian Universalists right now.
Is it a concern that it's a relatively small group, or
It's a small group, but we've always been small in relationship to other religious communities, and we've always been small in relationship to our influence in the culture. And that influence tends to ebb and flow, but we're almost always more influential than our numbers would indicate.
Okay.
So but we do care about that because we think everybody who feels that they're a Unitarian Universalist should find a community to be part of, and we want to make sure that people who need that message of freedom and exploration find us.
And there are very few Black Unitarians.
Yes, there are very few. I married a person who was Black and Unitarian Universalist and raised that way, and that is extraordinarily rare.
And why is that?
I think in part because there is a whole history and tradition of African American churches as not only religious communities, but as political and cultural communities that were homogeneous and empowering for people of color. And Unitarians and Universalists and Unitarian Universalists in our merged state were much more reflective of the larger American culture with all its benefits and all of its shortcomings, and that includes the issue of segregation. The best and the most fertile time for the sort of melding and the growth among people of color in Unitarian Universalism was in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, because Unitarian Universalists were very active in the Civil Rights movement.
That's true. That's true.
Profoundly active. And two members of the two Unitarians died as part of the Civil Rights Movement. Viola Liuzzo, who was shot and killed while she was transporting people during voting rights registration, was from the Unitarian Universalist Church of Detroit. And James Reeb, the Unitarian minister who was killed in Selma. And the response of Unitarians to those murders was to become more active. But when the Black Power movement became more invigorated, and when African Americans began to understand how important it was to be self-determining, even in the struggle for civil rights, there was, I think, a split around whether or not white allies were important or even necessary. And I think that had a big impact on whether or not that growth was going to continue in our faith.
Right. Is it one of your goals to bring more Blacks into the Unitarian fold?
I think it is for me personally. I try to talk a lot to friends of mine who are really religious, but really have trouble with some of the traditional African American church structures, beliefs, and cultural aspects. You know, I went to seminary with some friends who I keep telling, I said, you really are Unitarian, and you really need to think about coming on over to our side of it. But it's very hard to give up the church of your childhood. It really is.
That's true.
And so I think that for most African Americans, for them to become Unitarian Universalists means to give up the church of their childhood. And so I don't necessarily make it about this big tragic moment that, African Americans aren't part of Unitarian Universalism. The draw has to be something greater than, let me just go find this new faith. So.
Does your status as a Unitarian minister ever put you into conflict with Black Christians who tend to be very serious about their religion, very serious about
all
Jesus?
The time. All the time. Even my friends who are my friends from seminary are always teasing me about, y'all need more Jesus, and I'm like, we got Jesus, we just also have Buddha and a few other people that we like to talk to and about. So, but yeah, I'm almost always in conflict with more traditional African American church structures. The issue of same-sex marriage puts me in conflict with a certain generation of African American religious leaders all the time, because Unitarian Universalists have been active around same-sex marriage and marriage equality issues since the 1960s. So that's not new to us, but it's new to a whole host of other religious communities, and that's a tough one for some people.
How would you describe the current status of women ministers in this country? One study that I looked at said that in 2009, and they were looking at Protestant churches, about 10% of Protestant churches had women who were senior ministers. And as you know, like the Southern Baptists, no women ministers.
None in the seminaries.
You don't have it, and it's very rare among Black Baptist church that a woman will be a senior minister, or even if she's an associate minister, she will ever get to preach.
Well,
so how are women doing in the ministry these days? Is my question.
I think it's still an issue for the vast majority of women who are in positions of religious leadership. Unitarian Universalists, of course, are the polar opposite of that. I think the tipping point occurred for us in in the early 2000s, but 55% of Unitarian Universalist ministers are women.
Really?
Yes, and that's a huge change.
That's
That is a
dramatic.
very huge change, and it's a very specific change that began in the 80s and 90s as women began to pursue liberal religious careers. But for the most part, women still have a hard way to go. I'm remembering when I was in seminary, and every woman that I went to seminary with, especially the women who were Baptist, ended up having to transfer out of the particular Baptist tradition they were in to get ordained, because the churches that they were part of just dragged it out and dragged it out and dragged it out and kept putting up hoops and obstacles for them to get ordained. A couple of women became ABC, American Baptist Convention.
Okay.
A couple of them became Disciples of Christ because it was easier for them. It's tough. It's really tough.
What was seminary like? Was it what you expected, or was it, I went to law school and I had no idea what I was getting into.
Seminary's like
Was it really?
Well, I remember thinking, oh, I'll just take some classes, I'll go to seminary, I'll do this, and I'll move through the process. And what I didn't understand as fully as I should have, I think, is that it's a kind of disassembling the old you and putting together a new you. It's like taking a cucumber and making a pickle out of it. And once you're a pickle, you're never a cucumber again. The toughest part, I think, is relationships in seminary.
Really?
In fact, I made it my business to talk about this with my husband at some point in my first year, maybe at the end of my first year. When I started seminary, there were a group of us, and we were already married. And by the time my first year in seminary ended, 5 of those people, men and women, had broken up. So after I'd heard the 5th story about this couple that had started together and weren't together, I came home from school and said, honey, we need to talk. And Bob was like, oh no, because whenever I say we need to talk, it's going to be this big serious conversation. And I said, look, I've just heard about the 5th couple that broke up, and I don't want us to sacrifice our marriage on the altar of my wanting to do this. And if you've got trouble, you need to talk to me about it. And I was being very earnest.
So what is it about seminaries that destroys marriages?
It's not, I don't think seminaries destroy marriage. What I think happens is that when you when you feel this call and you want to serve God and you want to serve the world, everything changes, your perspective changes, and you want everybody to feel like this with you, and you're learning all this stuff and you're reading all these things in the Bible, and you want the person you love most in the world to do this with you. And Bob told me that God called me, God didn't call him. And as long as I was okay with that, he would be more than okay with that. I've been blessed. I have a wonderful, supportive husband, my college sweetheart. So he's been with me every step of the way for everything I've ever done. And he just wanted to make sure that I wasn't trying to make him a minister or make him be anybody except who he was. And I think that when you have couples who try to transform the other to match what's going on with them, you run into trouble.
Okay. Are there similarities between being a minister and being a journalist?
Yeah, there are actually. There's this desire for the truth. There's this notion of wanting to explain. I find it very helpful to have been a journalist for preaching. Because when I get up and I want to talk about something, I research it just like I would a story. I go online, I look at stuff, I have quotes, I do things. I use some of the same techniques because I want to explain something to people. I want to talk about, okay, here's how you can look at this particular situation. If you're troubled about this, here's what other people say. And here's what I think, and here's what you might think, and how might we talk about this together? So there's this sense of trying to increase understanding that is common among the best of journalists, and I think the best of ministers too. So,
what's the most rewarding part of your job?
Having somebody come up and say that something I told them made a difference for them. I've had people tell me that they changed careers because of something I said in seminary, in preaching on Sunday. I've had people come up to me and say, I've been struggling with this for a long time, and you really helped me today. That part's wonderful. When you get to say something and it makes a difference in somebody's life, it changes somebody's life. You get heard and their life changes and they're happier.
Right.
It's a wonderful thing.
I think you get some of that in journalism,
You
too.
do. You absolutely do. And that's one of the other similarities about
Yeah.
it, if you're doing the kind of journalism you most want to do.
Well, I'm happy that you're happy in your transition.
Thank you. It's been wonderful. It really has.
Our time is up. I want to thank the Reverend Rosemary Bray McNatt for joining me today. For the City University of New York and One to One, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. If there are any people you'd like to hear from or topics you'd like us to explore, please let us know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.